Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about the poetry of Gregory Scofield, whom I'm reading out of Native Poetry in Canada. So Scofield is a Metis poet, a contemporary Metis poet, and a lot of his work has to do with the sort of difficulties of Metis identity, and specifically feeling divorced from his Metis identity, the poet persona's Metis identity, and then rediscovering or reconnecting with it, along with sort of broader Canadian prairie culture, right? This sort of culture of country music, cowboy clothes, the Calgary Stampede, right? This sort of prairie provinces culture, because the sort of centers of the largest communities of Metis people, I believe, are in, I want to say Alberta, but they're in the Plains provinces. They're in the Prairies provinces. So that culture is the context out of which a lot of Metis people come. So the first poem that I'm going to read to you is called What a Way to Go. And it is about this sort of loss, this sense of being divorced from one's Indigenous identity, particularly going from Indigenous communities, which are often in rural areas, to urban environments, urban areas, which many Indigenous people do, looking for work, looking for opportunities that don't exist in those rural communities, reservations, places like this, or looking to escape, looking to get away from the poverty, drug and alcohol, domestic violence, etc., that is really driven by the poverty of many rural areas. Unfortunately, many people, Indigenous or otherwise, come to cities impoverished and find that poverty is also an urban problem. But this is What a Way to Go. Middle of the month, we're so hard-pressed, hunting through every pocket, hoping I stashed a little something away, teasing gum wrappers show up, my lucky prize jingling deep down between the lining, escaped coins just frustrate. What is Her Majesty doing for supper tonight? Fry bread sounds good. We might have moose if we were bush Indians, but our appetite is city cuisine. Back home our elders have ancient taste buds, wintertime they stock up, long-distance hunting stories confirm who is a good grandson, staying put, keeping freezers filled, coming together to feast. It all seems so simple. Taking from the land, being thankful. In the city, we hunt each other, looking to borrow some flour, sugar, tea, just enough to get by till the end of the month. So again, we have that sort of, that disconnect from Indigenous culture and age-old means of survival, modes of survival that allow for a sustainable life cycle, right? A sustainable approach to existing alongside and as part of the natural world. And that gets sort of ripped away in urbanization, right? In cities, we are no longer connected to the land. We are no longer connected to natural cycles, etc., etc. And so culture and so that sort of need for reciprocity gets transferred from we will harvest a moose and give thanks to the moose in sustainable ways, etc., to we will borrow from one another because that is the only place that resources are available without cash. And of course, for many impoverished people, that substantially limits what they have access to, right? This is a big problem. But Scofield's poetry, at least from the selections here, I would say more often is about reconnecting with a Metis identity. So we get that in this next poem, God of the Fiddlers, God of the Fiddle Players. And again, this one is about sort of not entirely feeling comfortable in Metis cultural spaces, but sort of recognizing that as home and that sort of that desire to reacclimate, right? So this is God of the Fiddle Players. The wilting sun catches them center stage, taking a well-deserved breather. Safely shielded by the big top, easy for me to applaud for more, an old-timer's favorite, my mom would say. Surveying the dance floor, my generation is damn near lost. Even me, I don't know how to promenade properly, let alone that quick heel-toe on-the-spot step. Gyrating to a techno beat is more my history. Then again, who can dig roots in the city? I have to ask a friend about being Metis, what there is to be proud of. Because she's an elder, she says, just watch, listen. Later we join the pilgrimage to the graveyard, to the museum. They have a special show using mannequins to reenact the Northwest resistance. Weeping openly, I got to meet the heroes I was ashamed of in school. That summer, the God of the Fiddle Players visited Batoche. I bought my first sash, wearing it proudly around the house, practicing the ins and outs of jigging. So there's a lot going on in this poem, right? This sort of sense of coming to this space that is culturally significant for the Metis people. This sort of dance or party of some kind, and feeling that one doesn't belong and yet does belong, right? This sort of sense of this sort of deep love of this music, but also this unfamiliarity with it, the inability to dance properly to this music because you've been raised on a different music in a different environment. But then this sort of reconnection with history, right? This discussion of the Northwest resistance, right? This was a 1880s, I think, if I remember correctly, opposition, uprising against the Canadian government's encroachment on and attempts to colonize is maybe not exactly the most comprehensive word for it, but basically to gain control over the Metis. And it was a resistance movement against settler colonialism and the attempt to impose a settler colonial Anglophone culture onto the Metis in a sort of culturally genocidal way, right? And it's this sort of major event in Metis history. So there's that element of it, right? And this sort of sense of like this reclamation of that cultural memory, right? This idea of these were the heroes, Louis Riel, people like this, that these were the heroes that the poet persona was ashamed of when he was in school. Presumably a settler colonial school that teaches the Northwest resistance as opposition to the proper good Canadian government, right? The sort of rah-rah, the Mounties, Canadian manifest destiny, which I don't think is really a concept in Canada. It is here in the US, unfortunately, and it's created a lot of problems for us and made us terrible as a nation in many ways. But there you go. You get what you get. Right, so this sort of this reconnecting with one's identity. Even this reference to I bought my first sash, right? For the Metis, these sort of woven sashes, and traditionally, I think there's a sort of waist belt, and it's a very, very long waist belt. So like it wraps around, like you start basically from like right about here, like side, it wraps all the way around and then comes back, and you knot the ends. And then there's two sort of garter sashes that tend to go with it, right? And this goes back to the fur trade, because one of the sort of origins of the Metis is French, predominantly French fur traders intermarrying with indigenous women, primarily because there weren't that many French women who came to New France and subsequently Quebec and Canada more broadly, right? It was primarily men who came for the fur trade. And this is really the origin of the Metis people, right? They're a sort of hybrid ethnic identity blending French culture more than Anglophone Canadian culture, but Anglophone Canadian culture as well. But blending that with indigenous cultures, primarily, I think, from like the Cree, the Ojibwe, these different nations, tribes, or bands in the sort of central part of southern Canada, right? Places that are now like Alberta, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, places like this. Right, so that sort of buying my first sash, right? It's a bit. This isn't necessarily this is an analogy that will make sense, I think, to sort of non-Indigenous people, but it's maybe not the most accurate one. It's a bit like the sort of Metis equivalent of getting a ritual headdress, right? It's really not the same because the sort of religious symbolism is not the same, but as a sort of cultural identity marker, it's maybe comparable. So that's sort of central to this. And one of the other things about Scofield that is connected, again, to this sort of, or about Scofield's poetry that's connected to this sort of reclamation of a Metis or prairie identity, is that music is a big component of his poetry, a big influence, especially things like country, folk, and indigenous music. So the last of his poems that I'm going to read you in this video really is sort of inspired by that, specifically by Jimmie Rodgers's Blue Yodel #1. Jimmie Rodgers, of course, one of the great stars of early country music, very, very distinct style, and he did yodel. That was a big part of Jimmie Rodgers's thing. And this poem, T4, T, capital T, period, FOR, this is a sort of indigenous reworking of one of Rodgers's songs, Blue Yodel #1. So this is T4. Texas, T for Tennessee, T for Texas, T for Tennessee, T for Thelma, that gal that made a wreck out of me. If you don't want me, mama, you sure don't have to stall. Lord, Lord, if you don't want me, mama, you sure don't have to stall, 'cause I can get more women than a passenger train can haul. And the needle would catch, slide into its well-worn groove, refusing to budge like Fat Paul the bootlegger, our very own small-town Buddha. Even weighted with pennies and promises it wouldn't move, so T was always for Texas, Tennessee for Thelma, that invisible gal that made a wreck out of the record, so T ended up strummed in D, sung in C minor, D for Desmarais, Alberta, C for the Carter family and Harry. If you don't want me, Daddy, you sure don't have to call. If you don't want me, Daddy, you sure don't have to call, 'cause I can get more Nietzsche musuk than a dog sled can haul. And the needle and Fat Paul scratched and waited stubborn as hell, thinking it was damn funny till they both got busted. Lyrics sung by Jimmy Rogers, Blue Yodel #1 from Down the Old Road. So again, it's what you're getting in this poem is this engagement with a sort of mainstream Anglophone Canadian prairie culture, right? Early country especially is a big component of sort of Western culture, broadly speaking, in both Canada and the United States. Prairie culture, country music is really central, along with, things like Southern rock, etc., etc. But we have this sort of reworking, repurposing, and this connection with the figures and structures of this localized Metis culture. So again, one of the things that we see sort of across Scofield's poetry is this renegotiation of the poet persona's relationship to Metis culture.